She stood in the middle of my kitchen and laughed. Not a polite laugh, not even a surprised one. It was that particular laugh she'd always had when she thought she'd caught me pretending to be something I wasn't. Head tilted, one hand resting on the granite island like she owned it, teshed. "I have to say," she said, turning slowly to take in the open concept living room, the high ceilings, the cedar beams I'd spent 3 weekends staining myself. "I genuinely didn't think you had it in you." I poured the tea and said nothing. That was 6 months ago. And honestly, it still sits with me the way certain things do when you're past 60 and you stopped pretending they don't. My wife and I separated this spring our younger daughter finished university. Not divorced right away. We floated in that gray area for almost 14 months before anyone signed anything. Those 14 months were the longest of my life, and I say that as a man who once drove a logging truck in northern British Columbia through a February whiteout for 11 hours straight. Her name was Diane. Is Diane. She's still alive, still in Kelowna, still doing exactly what she always did, which is presenting herself as the competent one, and letting the rest of the world assume the rest. We'd been married for 27 years, that's not nothing. I want to be clear about that before anything else. There were good years. There were years I'd give anything to go back to. Camping in the Okanagan with the girls when there were small, long winters in our first house on Osprey Street with the old oil furnace that clanked all night, Sunday mornings when nobody had anywhere to be. Those were real. I'm not going to pretend the whole thing was a waste just because it ended badly. But it did end badly. By the time our youngest, Tara, graduated from UBC, Diane and I had been sleeping in different rooms for the better part of 2 years. We'd stopped fighting openly. We'd moved past that into something colder and harder to name. We were polite to each other the way strangers are polite. We said please and thank you, and we didn't step in front of each other in the kitchen. That was the whole of it. The separation was her idea formally, though it had been coming for longer than either of us admitted. I moved out of the house on Osprey, the house we'd owned outright by then. The house I'd put new windows in the year before. The house I'd refinished the floors in over a long weekend in October that still lives in my body as 3 days of solid back pain. And I rented a 1-bedroom above a dry cleaner on Bernard Avenue. I didn't fight her on the house. My lawyer at the time, a man I've since stopped using, told me I had grounds to push for a more even split of the equity. We'd both contributed. The house was as much mine as hers. But I was tired in a way that goes bone deep, and Diane had already started talking to mutual friends about how difficult I was being, how unreasonable, how I was putting our daughters in the middle of things. I wasn't. But I also knew that fighting it would mean 2 years in court watching her be reasonable on the stand while I looked like the difficult one. I know how these things go. I've watched enough of my friends go through it. So I let her have the house. What I didn't know, what I found out 14 months later when the final papers were being reviewed, was that Diane had moved money, not a small amount, over the previous 2 years while I'd been driving to appointments with that lawyer and sleeping above a dry cleaner and trying to keep things civil for the girls. She had quietly transferred funds from our joint investment account into an account that was hers alone, systematically. Small enough amounts, often enough that it didn't look like what it was. It was about $64,000. My new lawyer, a woman named Helen who I found through Tara's recommendation and who I will be grateful to for the rest of my life, caught it during discovery. She laid it out on a spreadsheet with the dates and the amounts and the destination account and slid it across the table to me without saying a word. I sat with it for a long time. "What do I do with this?" I asked her. "That's up to you," she said. "But I'd like you to understand what your options are before you decide." She walked me through them. We could pursue it formally through financial fraud provisions in the divorce proceedings, which would likely result in a clawback plus penalties. It would also mean a longer process, more cost, and Diane would absolutely portray it as me trying to destroy her. It would reach our daughters. It would reach the community we'd shared for 3 decades. Or Helen could use it as leverage, quietly, The way things sometimes get resolved when everyone involved is over 50 and nobody actually wants to sit in a courtroom for a year. I thought about it for a week. Then I told Helen to use it as leverage. Diane's lawyer called 2 days later. The settlement was revised. I came out of it with an amount that was fair, not punitive, not even particularly satisfying in the moment, just fair. The house stayed with Diane. Some other assets were redistributed. The $64,000 was effectively returned, not as an admission of anything, just as a recalculation of what we each walked away with. Diane never acknowledged it. Not directly. I don't think she fully understood what had happened, or maybe she understood exactly what had happened and decided the only way forward was to pretend it hadn't. That's always been one of her skills. The ability to walk away from a version of events she didn't like and simply begin narrating a different one. The different version she began narrating, and I heard this through enough channels over the following months that I stopped being surprised by it, was that I had behaved badly in the divorce, that I'd been vindictive, that I'd tried to take things that weren't mine, that she'd had to fight to protect herself from a man who, when it came down to it, had never been the person she'd thought she married. My older daughter, Renata, lives in Halifax with her husband and their 2 boys. She heard some version of this story and called me in March, about 8 months after the papers were signed. She was careful on the phone the way you are when you've heard things and you're not sure what to believe. Dad, she said, I just want to understand what happened. I told her. All of it. The account, the transfers, the spreadsheet Helen had put in front of me, the settlement. I told her quietly and without editorializing, the way my own father used to tell me hard things, just the facts, one after another, and then silence. She was quiet for a long time. Why didn't you tell us? She said finally. Because you're her daughters too, I said, and I didn't want you to have to carry it. Another silence. Dad, she said, that was either very noble or very stupid. I laughed. First real laugh I'd had in weeks. Tara took longer. She's always been closer to her mother, not in a way that ever felt like a verdict on me, just in the way second children sometimes are, shaped by a different version of the family than the one the first child knew. Tara was in Vancouver, and I was in Kelowna, and we'd always been loving but slightly out of sync, the way you can be with someone you care about when geography and habit create their own kind of distance. It was Tara's wedding planning actually that changed things. She'd been with her partner for 4 years, a kind, steady man named Joel who works in environmental consulting and makes my daughter laugh in a way I hadn't seen her laugh in a long time. When they got engaged the previous fall, Diane immediately became central to the planning in the way Diane always becomes central to things. Menus, venues, guest lists, flowers. The wedding was in Kelowna, and Diane knew everyone, and Tara let it happen because it was easier than the alternative. I was kept informed but not consulted. That's the most honest way I can describe it. About 3 months before the wedding, Tara called me. It was a Sunday evening and I was out on the back deck of my rental watching the light go off the lake. I'd moved by then from the flat above the dry cleaner to a small house on the east side of Kelowna with a proper yard and a view of the water, and she sounded tired in a way that I recognized. Mom's been telling people that you refuse to help pay for the wedding, she said. That she's carrying the whole thing herself. I set down my coffee mug. Did she tell you that? I said. No, Tara said. I heard it through Aunt Beverly. Beverly is Diane's sister, and the two of them have been a closed loop since childhood, so there was nothing surprising about the direction of that particular piece of information. What surprised me was that Tara was calling to ask me about it, which meant she'd had a doubt, which meant something in her had shifted. I've offered twice to contribute, I said. Both times through you, and both times you told me the budget was covered and you'd let me know if that changed. I know, she said. Has your mother mentioned that I offered? A pause. No. We talked for a long time that night, not just about the wedding, about the last 2 years, about what the separation had actually looked like from where I was standing, about some of what had happened with the settlement. Not all of it, not the financial specifics, but enough of the shape of it, that she could understand there was a shape, that it wasn't just two people who'd grown apart and divided things sensibly. By the end of the call, she was crying quietly, not dramatically, just that particular exhausted kind of crying that happens when something you've been holding doesn't need to be held anymore. "I'm sorry, Dad," she said. "You don't have to be sorry," I said. "You didn't do anything wrong. I believed things I shouldn't have." "You believed your mother," I said. "That's not a character flaw." The wedding was in July. Beautiful day. That particular kind of Okanagan July that feels like a gift every time. The light honey gold in the lake flat and dark in the distance, and everything smelling of pine and dry grass. Joe's family came from Toronto, and they were warm and easy to be around, and I walked my daughter down the aisle in a dark suit that Renata had helped me choose over a video call with a glass of wine and a lot of opinions. Diane and I were cordial. We stood near each other in photographs. We did not speak at length. I was fine. After the wedding, things shifted in ways I hadn't entirely expected. I'd been living in that rental house for over a year by that point, saving carefully and working with a financial planner in the way I should have started doing 20 years earlier. The settlement money was invested well. I'd also started picking up some part-time consulting work to my old firm. 32 years in civil engineering doesn't disappear when you retire. It just becomes a different kind of currency. I had a plan. I'd had the plan for about 18 months, working it slowly and carefully the way I've always worked things that matter. A piece of land on the south side of Kelowna, not right on the lake because those prices are what they are, but a corner lot with a mature tree line and a view of the ridge that I'd driven past for years and always thought about. I bought it the previous November. I'd spent the winter going through designers and the spring going through contractors. By the following summer, the house was underway. I didn't tell many people, not because I was hiding anything, but because I've reached an age where I understand the difference between privacy and secrecy, and this felt like something I wanted to complete before I had to explain it. Renata knew. Helen knew. My friend Gordon from the firm knew, because he came up from Vancouver twice to see the progress and stood in the framing with a coffee and made approving sounds about the roof pitch. Diane, as far as I could tell, did not know. What she knew, what she'd been telling people, apparently, and I know this because it still has a way of reaching me, was the version of me as cautionary tale. A man who'd had to walk away from a 27-year marriage with nothing because he hadn't been smart enough to protect himself. A man rattling around in a rental diminished. She wasn't cruel about it openly, I don't think. Just quietly definitive in the way she's always been, not vindictive so much as satisfied with a narrative that left her looking like the one who'd moved on cleanly. I ran into her at a wine shop on Pandosi Street about 2 weeks before the house was finished. It was a Saturday afternoon in September. She was with a friend I didn't recognize. Someone new in her orbit, which meant someone who'd only ever heard the settled version of the story. Diane looked well. She'd always looked well. She has that particular kind of composure that reads as contentment from a distance. We were civil. We asked after each other's daughters. The friend smiled politely and pretended not to be intensely aware of the situation. As we were parting ways, Diane said something that I've turned over many times since. She didn't say it cruelly. She said it the way you'd make a quiet, private observation that you'd stopped bothering to dress up. You always needed someone to push you, she said. I hope you found whatever that is. And then she said goodbye and walked to the till with her bottle and her friend, and I stood in the wine aisle for a moment with a Pinot Noir in my hand and thought about all the things I could have said. I didn't say any of them. I bought my wine and I went home. The house was finished on the 14th of October. I moved in over a weekend with help from Gordon and Joel, Tara's husband, who showed up with a truck in good humor and no agenda, which I appreciated more than I said. Renata flew out from Halifax for the first week. She walked through every room and asked questions about every decision, and stood on the back porch in the early morning with her coffee and said, "Dad, This is really something. It was something. 1,200 square feet of clean, considered space, nothing excessive, nothing for the sake of impressing anyone. Just good materials and good light, and a kitchen I'd thought about carefully, and a back porch that faced the ridge at an angle that catches the last hour of sun in the afternoon. The cedar beams were my idea. The designer had suggested something more contemporary, but I know what I like, and I like the weight of wood. I didn't call Diane. I want to be honest about my thinking here, because I've had time to examine it and I don't think it was entirely free of motive. I told myself I was calling to settle something for Tara's sake. Tara had been navigating the space between her parents for 2 years, and I thought there might be value in a civil encounter on my territory. A reset of some kind. Proof that this part of the story didn't have to stay bitter. All of that was true. But I also knew what she'd been saying, and I'm 63 years old and I'm not above wanting someone to see that the story they'd been telling about me was wrong. So I called Diane in November, and I asked if she'd like to come for tea. I kept it simple. I said I was settled in the new place and it seemed like a reasonable thing. 1 cup of tea, a chance to be 2 adults who'd once been something to each other and could acknowledge that without it being a wound. She said yes. I think she expected the apartment above the dry cleaner, or something close to it. She drove up on a Sunday afternoon, parked in the driveway, and sat in her car for a moment before she got out. I watched from the kitchen window. I watched her look at the house. The proportions, the cedar detail on the dormers, the rock garden along the front walk that I'd laid myself over 3 October weekends. I watched her face do something that it almost immediately stopped doing. Then she got out of the car and came to the door. I opened it before she knocked. "Hi," I said. She looked past me into the house, then back at my face, then into the house again. "Is this?" She started and stopped. "Come in," I said. She came in slowly. She stood in the front hallway and looked at the ceiling, at the light, at the sight line, through to the back porch and the ridge beyond. She walked to the kitchen the way people walk when they're calculating something they didn't expect to calculate. Her hand touched the counter briefly, just the tips of her fingers, and then she pulled it back. "You built this," she said. It wasn't a question exactly. "I did," I said. "How long has this been?" She paused. "When did you start this?" "About 2 years ago," I said. "Started planning anyway. Ground broke in spring." She stood there for a moment in the middle of my kitchen with the afternoon light coming through the south windows, and I put the kettle on and got out the mugs and didn't say anything else. There didn't seem to be anything else to say. The house said it. The cedar beams said it. The view of the ridge said it. Eventually, she turned and looked at me. "You always needed someone to push you," she'd told me 2 weeks earlier in the wine shop on Pandosi. She didn't say it now. She sat down at the kitchen table and wrapped both hands around the mug I'd set in front of her and looked out toward the porch. We talked for about an hour. About the girls, about Joel and the consulting work he was doing, about Renata's boys who were apparently in a hockey phase. We didn't talk about the settlement. We didn't talk about Beverly or the things that had been said. Neither of us brought up the wine shop. When she stood up to leave, she put on her coat in the front hallway and looked around one more time. "It's a good house," she said. "I know," I replied. She nodded once. Not warmly, not coldly. Just once. Like someone acknowledging a fact they'd rather have encountered privately. Then she walked down the front steps and across the rock garden to her car, and I stood in the doorway and watched her go. I didn't feel triumphant. I want to be honest about that too, because I know what you're expecting me to say, and I think the honest version is quieter than that. What I felt mostly was tired and settled. The way you feel at the end of a day when you've done the thing you set out to do, and it's exactly as hard as you expected, and you don't need to tell anyone about it. Tara called the next evening. She'd spoken to her mother. "She said your house is beautiful," Tara told me. "It is," I said. A pause. She also said you seemed good. I am good, I said. Another pause, longer. I'm glad, Dad. I went out on the back porch after we hung up. The ridge was dark against a sky that still held some light at the edges, the deep blue that doesn't happen anywhere quite like it does in the Okanagan in November. The yard was quiet. The cedar was solid over my head. I've spent a lot of years being told who I was, by a job title, by a marriage, by a story someone else decided to start telling and then didn't know how to stop. I don't think I ever fully understood, until I was standing in that house I'd built, how little any of it had actually been about me, how much of it was just someone else's need for the story to go a particular way. I'm 63. I have a house I built from a plan I made when I had nothing but a rented room and the lawyer who believed me. I have 2 daughters who know the shape of what happened, and a son-in-law who showed up with a truck on moving day and asked no questions. I have a back porch that faces the ridge and catches the last hour of sun. That's the whole of the story, really. The certainty of it. Not the granite counter or the cedar beams or the look on a woman's face when she understood she'd been narrating the wrong ending. Just the certainty. There's a particular kind of quiet that comes after you've stopped trying to explain yourself to people who weren't listening in the first place. I know that quiet well now. I lived in it for 2 years above a dry cleaner on Bernard Avenue, and I built something in it that nobody expected, including me. What happened between Diane and me didn't unfold the way it looks from the outside. It rarely does. She moved money she had no right to move, and for a long time she walked away from that without consequence, or what looked like no consequence. She got the house we'd built together. She got the story where she was the capable one, the one who held things together, the one who had been generous in the face of a difficult man. None of that was true, but truth doesn't always move quickly. What I understand now, and I didn't fully understand it while it was happening, is that every choice I made during those 2 years was also a kind of answer. Not to Diane, to myself. When Helen put that spreadsheet in front of me, and I chose not to pursue it publicly, not to drag my daughters through a legal fight that would have taken years and cost all of us more than money, that wasn't weakness. That was a calculation made by someone who knew what he valued and what he didn't. I value my daughter's peace more than I value being vindicated in a courtroom. That's not passivity. That's knowing what the thing you're protecting actually is. The intelligence in that season of my life wasn't obvious. It wasn't the sharp kind that announces itself. It was the quiet kind, the kind that says, let Helen handle this, let the settlement speak, let time do the thing that confrontation can't. It was understanding that the $64,000 wasn't the wound. The wound was the story she was telling, and no court ruling was going to change that story in the minds of people who already believed it. What would change it was time and the visible truth of a life that had continued. And the life did continue. That's the part I want people who are sitting in their own difficult seasons to hear. There were mornings in that rental when I was 61 years old and starting over, and the weight of it was real and heavy. Not dramatic, just heavy. The way ordinary hard things are. I could have stopped at that weight and let it define what the next decade looked like. I didn't. I made a plan. I worked it slowly. I called my daughters and told them the truth when they were ready to hear it. The house didn't build itself. That's what Diane didn't understand when she stood in my kitchen and touched the counter with her fingertips. Every beam and stone and sightline toward that ridge was the result of 2 years of quiet, deliberate, unhurried work by a man who had been told he needed someone to push him. I don't need someone to push me. I never did. I needed to stop spending my energy on people who confuse motion with direction. That's the whole of what I've got. Do the honest thing even when nobody's watching. Think carefully before you act, especially when you're angry. And keep going when it's hard, not because some reward is guaranteed, but because the kind of person you become by keeping going is worth becoming. The rest sorts itself out.